Welcome to Asia Pacific Defence Reporter, your go-to source for cutting-edge security insights in the region. Get ready for rapid-fire analysis and commentary from the Asia Pacific with your host, Kim Bergman.
Hello and welcome back to podcast number 50. But there's no time for self-congratulation because there's a lot more defence incompetence to comment on of a depth that surprises even me. Now, top of the list, more details are emerging about the General Purpose Frigate project, not in this country, but overseas. Think about that for a moment, just that. Defence won't speak about this project at all. Not to Australian industry, not to journalists, not to analysts, not to commentators, complete silence. So we have to learn from overseas presentations about what is going on in this country, which I think is outrageous. Now, speaking at something called the Defence Leaders Combined Naval Event 2024 in Farnborough, UK, on the 23rd of May, Rear Admiral Stephen Hughes, Head of Navy Capability, who I don't think I've ever met, said that the acquisition of a zero design change solution was the only way to have an acquisition program underway and a contract before the end of 2026, with the first ship delivery to follow in 2029. Now, this reporting mentioned the four platforms that we know about in the 3,000 to 4,000 ton range: the Miko 200, the Megami, the Daewoo class FFX Batch 2, and the Chungnam class FFX Batch 3, and also in a separate category, the Alpha 3000 from Navantia. And this is a quote in a magazine called Naval News of the Rear Admiral saying, "The government mandated that these exemplar designs from Germany, Japan, the Republic of Korea and Spain would be the basis of the capability and the approach to both market and government by the end of the year of what would be a viable capability." He continued, "We're going to build initially 3 offshore, then we'll build 3 more of the same baseline onshore. And then what happens for ships 7 through 11 is something for future decisions around where the design goes." Now, I mean, some of this we've commented on before, this incredibly rushed schedule, no real justification for the process that's been adopted. Another thing to note here, first 3 overseas, but then remarkably building 3 more in Australia of the same baseline. So in other words, importing kits from whichever country is building the first 3 and assembling them here. I mean, it's just a nonsense. And ships 7 through to 11, I mean, my goodness, I mean, this is a complete lack of logic and planning. Anyway, he continued, "The government has already decided that the 4 exemplar designs, actually 5 of them, meet our capability needs, so I don't need to develop requirements because government's told me if you pick one of those 4, we're happy with that." He continued that 5 objective criteria will be applied to determine which of the 4 or 5 designs is the most suitable option. He said, in no particular order, they are to have manufacture underway in 2026 to deliver in 2029, transfer of the design for an onshore build in Australia, provide an effective maintenance and sustainment system that can be established in Australia, and another huge punchline here, maximum compliance with regulatory, legislative and class standards and interoperability with Australian and allied systems. Now, you cannot have both. You cannot take a ship built in a parent yard to a parent Navy specification and for that to be fully compliant, maximum compliance, as he says, with Australian regulatory and legislative standards, and also come with interoperability with Australian and allied systems. Impossible, flat-out contradiction. You cannot have both. You can either have a ship coming out of a parent yard and you take it with, just as it is, or you want a ship that is compliant with Australian standards and interoperable with Australian and allied systems. That there's just no way that those objectives can, in any shape or form be linked together. They're just mutually contradictory. Anyway, he continued. Again, in the UK, you'd never hear a word of this in Australia. However, there's an implicit understanding that there will be no design change, he continued. We're taking it out of the box, his words, said Rear Admiral Hughes. The program objectives will be the means by which we assess what is viable and non-viable. The discipline that the government has put on us is remarkable. Anyway, responding to questions from the audience, he insisted that zero change was the right approach for the General Purpose Frigate acquisition, arguing that while there would be a high level of combat system commonality in Tier 1 forces, the Tier 2 requirement presented a new opportunity. He said, "We've made the decision that we're out of the Anzac frigate business, so whatever we choose, whatever standard we go with, we're going to adopt that. We're going to have discipline around that capability." Is he seriously arguing that a frigate with the combat system for Saudi Arabia, Egypt, South Korea, or Japan is going to be fully compatible with Australian and Allied combat systems? No, they won't be. None of them will be, let alone this earlier business about regulation, certification. More on that to come. He continued, there may be an opportunity where, in time, as we understand the design and we build the capability, we may choose to adjust and adapt depending on our strategic requirements. But what government is saying to us is, if it's good enough for another navy, it's good enough for our navy. And for me, the only way I was going to get capability quickly was to say, we're going to do a no-change program. I think this is an opportunity, not a risk. The risk is we don't choose wisely and we don't understand the designs. We've made it very clear with our 4 exemplar design companies, 5, that we need to be totally transparent so that we can choose wisely. As I've been previously reporting, this is basically insane and unworkable. Everyone I have spoken with in industry who's now understanding what is going on is absolutely horrified by this process, this idea that we're going to spend billions of dollars in overseas shipyards getting something that the Navy fully expects to be compatible with Australian systems and regulations, when even a primary school child could look at the circumstances and conclude that's impossible. Now, back to the designs for a moment. The journalist who wrote the piece, Richard Scott, who I know, great reputation, very experienced, he structured the article around the 4 exemplar designs, the 3,000 to 4,000 ton range ships, plus the Navantia Alpha 3000, and that is presumably because it's a much smaller ship of barely 100 metres in length and a bit more than 2,000 tons in displacement. Now, I have raised the issue before. If it is on the shortlist, why has the offer of a Luerssen corvette built in Henderson using the existing Arafura workforce and the Australian supply chain? Now, I'm going to explain why. And this is a nasty little story that reflects extremely badly on defence. Now, the Luerssen corvette, I assume, wasn't even studied by the so-called independent review team that can't even get the list of designs correct, because Navy and Defence have painted themselves into a corner by smearing the Arafuras and the reputation of the designer Luerssen, and they are now unable to swallow their pride and award a new contract that would go a long way to addressing the surface fleet capability shortfall that now confronts us and which has generated this mindless panic around the general purpose frigates. So, let's talk a bit about the smearing of Luerssen, which I've mentioned in passing a few times, but I'm now going to give you some details that have never been revealed before. Well, one has been. Starting with the main gun. In a display of complete incompetence in the formative stages of the project, Defence selected a 40mm main gun from Leonardo, but subsequently discovered that their own processes required the gun to be certified, adding a huge additional expense. Now, Leonardo were given the option to withdraw, which they did, and they also received a multi-million-dollar payout for the broken contract. So thank you again, Australian taxpayer. Now, Plan B, and this was touched on in Senate estimates, was to instead equip the Arafuras with surplus 25mm Typhoon close-in weapons systems from Israeli company Rafael, very good system. Oh, and by the way, they could be upgraded cost-effectively to 30mm with all of the work done in Australia. But that doesn't matter because that effort has also stalled for reasons that no one knows or can understand, with the Arafuras having nothing more than 2 machine guns to go to sea with. But okay, this is the new stuff. Let's now turn to the matter at the heart of the delay, getting them into service, and its endless rounds of certification and documentation being required by Defence. Everyone involved in this has been sworn to secrecy, threats of jail, as usual, and I've had a very, very difficult job getting to the bottom of it, but I have been. And I've actually been helped by this insidious anti-Luerssen whispering campaign because a Defence source told me breathlessly a few weeks ago that the Arafura design was so bad that if ever there was a fire in the engine room, the smoke would immediately envelop the bridge, making the ship completely unmanageable. Now, as it happens, I've also had this whispered back to me by a couple of non-Defence insiders. So Navy's campaign of demonising the design and the designer is having some success, and that adds to an early whispering campaign about the alleged poor quality of the build, which in turn I investigated and which turned out to be total nonsense. But returning to the engine room fire, on closer examination, this horror story is also just made-up nonsense. The Arafuras are not open-plan ships. They have bulkheads, waterproof and fireproof doors, modern firefighting systems, and all of those things. What all of the hold-up is about seems to come down to, again, this wretched issue of certification and whether the fire doors are the ones that the RAN now wants. Now, let's recall for a moment that the Luerssen OPV was selected for its maturity and performance because the parent ship, actually 4 of them, were in service with the Royal Brunei Navy. During or just after the evaluation, the RAN thoroughly inspected the Bruneian ships. After that, the project has involved a multitude of reviews. This is the cascading waterfall style of project management, and because I've been out of it for a while, I've forgotten the names of most of them, but it starts with a system specification review and then a few other design reviews and then a very important one, the critical design review. Luerssen and the RAN went through all of this in excruciating detail, agreed on everything, and so the RAN signed off and they knew precisely what they were going to be getting. A couple of further things. There was a huge rush because of political pressure to start cutting steel by 2018, and this was achieved from memory in November 2017. And also because it was an OPV rather than a warship, it didn't seem to generate much evidence of high-level attention in Navy. And the continuing farce of the non-existent main gun is ample evidence of that. So let's be clear. All these problems, or alleged problems, are entirely due to Defence mismanagement. The rumours are false. Navy is receiving exactly the ship that they contracted, but now new people in the hierarchy have decided that they want something different, and so rather than being truthful and open about that, they're seeking to blame the designer. And now time for confession, because I might have inadvertently contributed to the damaged reputation of Navy's handling of the project by writing that on their instructions, as well as removing all of the weapons from the Bruneian ship, the Bruneians have a very effective 57mm main gun and 4 canisterized Exocet surface-to-surface missiles. All of that went. I wrote that they had also removed some of the strengthening of the rear deck, meaning it was no longer possible to land a 10-ton helicopter on it. Now, I must have misheard a briefing and combined with a truly bizarre official position of Navy that they would never actually operate a helicopter from it, just UAVs. I wrote that story on a couple of occasions because obviously I thought the situation was ridiculous and needed to be exposed. Anyway, About a year later, at an exceptionally rare briefing on a completely different project, from memory about Army watercraft, I was approached after the event by a senior defence person who rather nervously said to me that my reporting on the Arafura aft deck was wrong and that no strengthening had been removed. Now, to be fair, some helicopter-related stuff, such as the instrument landing system, had been canned, but apparently the deck is fine. But this left me horrified, and I said to this person, why not just call me or email the first time I incorrectly reported stuff? I aim to be completely accurate. It's awful and embarrassing to find out that detail contained in something I wrote is factually incorrect. So think about it. Things have now got so bad that we have a department that won't give out any information, but it's even worse than that because they are too scared to even correct things that they know to be wrong, which contributes to just misinformation about projects. Now, the situation has become so bad that just a few days ago, a confidential source inside the Department of Defence told another journalist that the rear deck of the Arafuras cannot be used for helicopter operations because of a major design flaw, blaming the designer Luerssen again. Now, thankfully, this was subsequently denied by the department in writing, but it just shows how far off the rails this has gone and how crazy the situation is. I'm really rushing because I'm running out of time and there are another couple of things to touch on. Vice Admiral Mead, head of the Australian Submarine Agency, gave an exceptionally rare interview to Brendan Nicholson, who I know well, and he revealed more stuff about the AUKUS submarines, namely that they will be more than 10,000 tonnes and that they will have a brand new reactor. Now, this is more insanity. It screams cost, risk and schedule, especially for a new naval reactor. The UK doesn't actually have a stellar record on nuclear reactors, nor project management for that matter, and we'll have a lot more to say about this in future podcasts. Now, also, Australian defence industry. Several companies are shaking up or changing their Australian management teams, and they include Hanwha Defence Australia, Raytheon Australia, and Northrop Grumman Australia. And it doesn't really matter in the scheme of things if people have been asked to resign or they've been sacked or they've been redeployed. It all amounts to the same thing. Now, defence industry management is usually quite stable, so something appears to be going on. Could it be coincidence? You can never rule that out, but I would say it's unlikely. Just too much activity happening in too many companies at the same point of time. Now, my best guess, for what it's worth, is that we're seeing a manifestation of the AUKUS effect. This government clearly has no genuine interest in Australian industry, and all companies are realising that. I think the multinationals are now just deciding to save a bit of money, and they're ridding themselves of pesky Australian involvement in projects by just simply centralising management back in corporate headquarters somewhere. Again, the bottom line is this government just doesn't care. The only thing that they obsess about is AUKUS. Finally, budget and the Australian Strategic Policy Analysis, which was issued, I think, on Friday of last week, confirms exactly what we have been saying. Namely, there is no meaningful increase in defence spending until 2027-28. After that, it goes on new submarines and the new frigates, potentially all built offshore, and then some missiles. Now, the government is, I'm reluctant to use the word lying, but I have to because lying implies intent. The government must know what the true situation is, and the fact that they continue to claim that there is a massive increase in defence spending when there isn't is just plain wrong. I wish there were more reporting on it. I mean, if this sort of misleading was happening in another portfolio area like health or education or whatever, I think it'd be front page news everywhere. I saw a piece in the Australian newspaper, but everyone else appears to have ignored the report. Okay, thank you very much for listening. Podcast number 50, a lot more to come. See you next time. Bye for now.
That's today's Asia Pacific Defence Reporter. For more in-depth articles, expert opinions and exclusive interviews, visit AsiaPacificDefenceReporter.com. Stay informed, stay ahead. This is your source for all things defence. Until next time.